My name is Melanie Reyes. I'm 28 years old, and 48 hours before I married the love of my life, my own parents cornered me in a church supply closet and gave me a choice: erase my grandfather from my wedding, or watch them walk out of it. He spent his whole career pushing a mop bucket, my mother said, adjusting an earring like the words cost her nothing. Do you understand what that looks like next to our friends? That man raised me. He drove me to school every single morning for a decade. My parents assumed the worst thing that could happen at my reception was 200 guests noticing a retired maintenance worker seated near the bride. They had no idea what was actually coming. When my father's own boss, the CEO of a company with thousands of employees, set down his champagne, straightened his jacket, and crossed an entire ballroom floor with every eye following him, my parents' whole understanding of our family cracked open in front of everyone they'd invited to impress. And honestly, even I didn't know the full truth yet. Welcome to Quiet Reckonings, where we tell true stories about the people who finally stopped shrinking themselves for families that never deserved the discount. If you believe the person who actually showed up for you deserves the best seat in the house, you're exactly where you need to be. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, because I promise you this story does not land where you think it will. I was 6 the year my parents relocated to the city for my father's career. He'd been hired into corporate leadership at a logistics company called Vantage Rail and Freight, a company he talked about the way other men talk about cathedrals. My mother went with him to build her real estate business among people who were, in her words, already arriving. I stayed behind with my grandfather, Samuel, because it was only temporary, they said. Just until we're settled, sweetheart. Temporary became first grade, then middle school. Then it became my entire childhood. My grandfather's house always smelled like lemon polish and percolated coffee, and dinner was on the table at 6 o'clock, no matter what the day had thrown at either of us. He worked as head custodian at Lincoln Elementary, the same school I walked to every morning. And every evening after he locked the last door in that building, he'd say the same 6 words, like they were stitched into him. Leave it better than you found it. He said it the day I knocked over a can of tempera paint in the art room and stayed after to scrub the floor myself. He said it the summer I cracked a neighbor's window and spent 3 months mowing lawns to pay for a new pane. He said it so often that eventually I stopped hearing the words at all, the way you stop noticing your own pulse. My parents visited every couple of months. To be fair, they never missed a birthday. But their visits felt less like family time and more like audits. My father would flip through my report card the way he reviewed shipping contracts, hunting for the number that dipped. And every time they pulled out of the driveway, my mother would linger on the porch a moment too long, eyeing my grandfather's trimmed hedges and freshly painted shutters the way she had a listing she desperately wanted but couldn't afford. I didn't have language for that look when I was 9 years old. I do now. Here's what you need to understand about my parents. My father, Daniel Reyes, is 55, a regional vice president at Vantage, a man who irons even the shirts he wears to relax in. My mother, Carol, 53, sells luxury homes and has her face on a billboard along the interstate. She has a warm laugh she reserves exclusively for clients. They aren't monsters. What they are is harder to explain, and in some ways worse. They keep a ledger. In our house, love was always something you earned in measurable units. Grades were points. Which college you got into was points. Your job title determined which league you were playing in. When I was 23, I called to tell them I'd been hired as a firefighter paramedic, full benefits, a pension, work that actually meant something in a town where people knew my face. My father went silent on the other end of the line for a long, uncomfortable stretch. Then he said, "And that's the story you're telling people?" He never raised his voice. He simply filed me into a lower bracket and moved the conversation along. My mother mailed me a blazer for interviews, eventually. I wore it once, to a funeral. But the strangest pattern, the one I noticed for years without ever fully understanding it, was how my father behaved around my grandfather. He didn't argue with him. He simply erased him. Company holiday parties, the steakhouse dinner my father threw the year he made VP, Grandpa Samuel was never on a single guest list. And he never once complained about it. I only asked my father about it directly one time, at Thanksgiving the year I turned 24. His expression shut like a garage door coming down. Some worlds aren't meant to overlap, Melanie. That was the entire explanation. It would take 4 more years, and my own wedding, before I understood exactly what he was so afraid of. Jordan proposed to me at the fire station mid-shift, which tells you everything you need to know about how patient he is. He teaches high school biology, laughs at his own jokes half a beat too early, and got down on one knee between an engine check and a call. I said yes before he even finished asking. We wanted something simple. A community hall downtown, 200 guests at most if both families stretched, my grandfather at the head table, and a honeymoon we could actually pay for without financing it. Then came the engagement dinner at my parents' house. My mother set the table with china that exists solely to be looked at, never used. After the appetizers, my father slid an envelope across the linen like he was closing a deal in a boardroom. Inside was a check for $35,000. So it's done the right way, he said. My mother squeezed my wrist. Think of it as staging, honey. A wedding is just a listing with a guest list. I want to be honest because it matters later. I hesitated. I'd spent my whole life managing my parents, softening their edges for other people, and some exhausted part of me thought, just take the check. Keep it peaceful. You know exactly how to handle them. So I said thank you. I told myself it was a gift, not a vote. My father agreed a little too fast. Then, while my mother poured the wine, he slid a second item across the table, a leather folder monogrammed, the kind he carries into executive meetings. Just some thoughts on the guest list, he said. I opened it expecting cousins and old family friends. What I found instead was an organizational chart wearing a wedding invitations clothing. 29 names, not one of whom I'd ever shared a meal with. Regional directors. 2 senior VPs. The head of West Coast operations. And underlined twice at the very top, Marcus Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer of Vantage Rail and Freight. My wedding had quietly become a corporate mixer squeezed between the salad course and the cake. It took a week of phone calls to understand why. Vantage's Senior VP of Operations had just retired. The position was still vacant, and my father had spent 2 decades positioning himself exactly one rung beneath that chair. My wedding was the one occasion where he could put a CEO, an open bar, and the Reyes name in the same room and call it a family gathering. So I did what I always did. I managed it. I gave up the acoustic trio I wanted because my mother said, folk music reads cheap. I gave up my chosen florist because my mother already had a girl. I told myself each concession was small, that keeping the peace mattered more than centerpieces, that I was protecting the parts that counted. Jordan watched me negotiate away my own wedding one phone call at a time and finally said, gently, "You keep calling it their event." I laughed it off. Then the seating chart arrived. My mother emailed it on a Sunday night, color-coded, professionally formatted. Vantage executives arranged around the dance floor like a security perimeter. I found Jordan's parents at a side table. My college roommate, tucked near the restrooms. And then I found my grandfather, the man who taught me to ride a bike in an empty school parking lot, seated at table 16, back corner, directly beside the kitchen door, behind a support pillar where no camera would ever reach him. I called my mother before I'd even finished scrolling. I kept my voice level, because level was the only tone that ever worked on Carol Reyes. He raised me. He belongs at the head table. She sighed the exact sigh she saves for clients who want granite countertops on a laminate budget. Sweetheart, the head table is for the wedding party and the hosts, and we're the hosts. It's simply cleaner this way. Cleaner. I wrote the word on the back of an envelope just so I could stop hearing it loop in my head. That evening I drove to my grandfather's house. He was out on the porch, oiling the hinges of the screen door, because in Samuel Reyes's world a squeaky hinge is a minor moral failure. I told him about table 16. I was ready to be furious on his behalf. He just wiped his hands on the rag that lives permanently in his back pocket and said, "I've had worse seats, kid. Don't set your family on fire over a chair." That's the thing about my grandfather, 79 years old, and I had never once heard him fight for his own dignity. I used to think he simply didn't know how. It never crossed my mind that a man could be so secure in who he was that he didn't need a room's permission to feel it. Before I left, I noticed his good suit hanging pressed on the closet door, brown dress shoes lined beneath it, polished by his own hand. Once a year, every year for as long as I can remember, he puts on that suit and disappears downtown for what he calls his pension appointment. That Thursday he was gone the entire afternoon. He came home with a silver pen clipped in his shirt pocket, engraved with a small compass rose. It looked expensive for a pension office. I didn't ask. If you want to understand my father, you have to go back to a school cafeteria in 1983. I only know this because his older sister, my Aunt Renata, let it slip over coffee while she was lobbying me toward flexibility on the seating chart. My father was 12. Grandpa Samuel worked maintenance at the old rail yard depot back then, and in a town that size, everybody knew whose son was whose. One lunch period, a table of boys whose fathers all wore suits decided to have some fun. They soaked a rag from the janitor's cleaning cart and dropped it on my father's tray, right on top of his food. One of them leaned in close and said, "Your dad missed a spot." The whole table laughed. My aunt said my father didn't say a single word. He walked home, dropped his tray story on the kitchen table like an accusation, and begged his father to find a different job. Any job, one that came with a desk. And my grandfather, who had a mortgage, 2 kids, and a wife whose health was already starting to fail, said the only thing he knew how to say. Work is work. My aunt swears my father never forgave that sentence. He mowed every lawn in the neighborhood until he could afford clothes no one would laugh at. He became the first Reyes to graduate college. He has spent the last 40 years of his life making absolutely certain no one ever drops a rag on his tray again. I sat in that coffee shop aching for a 12-year-old boy I'd never met. Then I remembered that boy was now 55 years old, and the man he kept punishing for it was his own father. That Sunday my mother texted, "Family meeting at the house. We need to discuss presentation." The family meeting had a slide deck. I wish I were exaggerating. I drove the 90 minutes into the city and sat at my parents' kitchen island while my father clicked through a presentation literally titled Reyes Chin Wedding, Run of Show. Vantage's little compass rose logo watermarked the corner of every single slide. There was a timeline. There was a photo protocol dictating which backdrops my mother had pre-approved. And on the second-to-last slide, in the same clean corporate font he uses for quarterly reports, seating optics, he set down the clicker and addressed me the way he addresses an underperforming branch. Marcus Whitfield would be seated 14 feet from the head table. Every regional director in attendance would have a direct sight line to my chair. And 4 feet from the bride, he said, would sit a retired school janitor in a department store suit. That's the story the company walks away with on Monday. That's the only story. He sits at the head table, Dad. My voice didn't shake, which I was quietly proud of, even though my hands had other plans. My father looked at me the way he looks at a spreadsheet that refuses to balance. Then he delivered the line he'd clearly rehearsed. In the car, in the mirror, probably his whole life. People remember the mop, Melanie. Not the man. My mother studied the quartz countertop, the one she'd have absolutely mentioned if it were relevant to the story. I picked up my keys and told them the conversation was over. My father called after me, calm as a weather forecast. Then you'd better hope nobody asks him what he did for a living. I sat in their driveway for 10 full minutes before I trusted myself to drive. My mother doesn't argue. She campaigns. Within a week, my phone had become a switchboard. Aunt Renata called first, and all the warmth from our coffee date had been replaced with talking points. Your father has worked 20 years for this. It's one dinner. Don't cost him his shot at that chair. I asked if she remembered telling me the cafeteria story. She said that was different. She couldn't explain how. She had a casserole in the oven. My cousin sent a paragraph-long text about respecting the older generation, rich, considering the older generation in question was the one being hidden behind a pillar. Even our officiant got a friendly call from my mother about streamlining the family elements of the ceremony. He told me about it with one raised eyebrow and let the subject die there. God bless him. By Friday, I understood the shape of it. My parents weren't lobbying for a seating chart. They were building a jury, so that when I eventually caved, it would look like consensus instead of surrender. And here's the part that genuinely scared me, it was working. When every phone call for a week tells you that you're the unreasonable one, you start doing math on your own conscience. Then Jordan came home from a parent-teacher night and mentioned, too casually, that his mother had gotten a call from mine about the right tone for the rehearsal dinner and a gentle suggestion about volume levels on the groom's side. My mother had recruited his parents like a listing. That was the night I stopped doing math. The following Sunday, Jordan's parents invited all of us to dinner, my grandfather included, with an actual mailed invitation, because his mother believes in stamps. I watched Grandpa Samuel walk into a home he'd never set foot in and get treated like visiting royalty. Jordan's father wanted his opinion on a sagging gutter. His mother wanted to hear, again, the story about the ice storm of '79. At one point, the screen door started sticking and Grandpa fixed it in under 10 minutes with a screwdriver from his truck, and nobody apologized for him and nobody was embarrassed. I sat there with a dinner roll in my hand, realizing I had never once seen my grandfather relaxed at my parents' table. Not once in 22 years. On the drive home, Jordan finally asked the question he'd clearly been carrying all evening. The father-daughter dance. What was I going to do? I stared at the road. Because here was the truth I hadn't said out loud yet, I was still planning to dance with my father. Tradition is tradition, I told him. You only get one dad. He let that sit for a while. Then quietly, and who taught you how to dance? I didn't answer. The real answer was a kitchen radio, a linoleum floor, an 11-year-old girl standing on the shoe tops of a man counting 1, 2, 3 under his breath, because her parents had canceled another visit. I turned the radio up in Jordan, who knows exactly when a thought needs room to finish itself. Let the silence stand. The next morning, my mother called about my final dress fitting and mentioned she'd finalized the family photo list with the photographer. She read the names out loud. It took until the end of the list for me to notice the name that wasn't on it. That missing name was the first tremor. The earthquake came a few days later, when I called our caterer to swap the entree and got a confused pause on the line. Oh, we'll need Mrs. Reyes to sign off on that. She's the primary contact now. The primary contact. While I'd been fielding phone calls all week, my mother had quietly upgraded the catering package and re-signed the contract under her own name. Same story with the photographer, whose revised invoice now listed a second shooter, dedicated to corporate guests, a phrase I hope to never type again in my life. It wasn't theft. It was cleaner than theft. Whoever signs decides. My mother has said that about real estate my entire life, and I had simply never imagined I would become the property in question. That night I sat at my kitchen table with every wedding document I owned, sorting them the way I sort emergency intake forms, ruthlessly. Florist, theirs. Caterer, theirs. Photographer, theirs. And at the bottom of the stack, the venue. Booked 11 months earlier, deposit paid straight from my own checking account, one signature line, and the signature was mine. I put my finger on that line and left it there a moment. My parents had bought the flowers, the food, and the photographs. They had not bought the room. The next morning I drove to my grandfather's, planning to lay out my strategy. Instead, he made me an offer that quietly broke my heart. He poured my coffee, sat me down at the same kitchen table where I'd done a decade of homework, and slid a folded bank statement across the wood. I've got a little put by, he said. No strings. Strings are your parents' hobby, not mine. The number was modest and careful, exactly what you'd expect from a man who still darns his own socks. I couldn't say anything for a second because my throat had closed up. A man who'd worked hard labor for 45 years was offering to empty his savings for a party. I told him no. I told him his only job was to wear the good suit, sit where I put him, and save me one dance if his knee allowed it. He grumbled that his knee was fine. It isn't. On my way out, I paused, like always, at the crooked row of photographs lining the hallway. My grandmother in her Easter hat. My academy graduation photo. And one I must have walked past 1,000 times without truly seeing, a young man, unmistakably my grandfather, wiry and grinning, standing beside the cab of an old freight truck with the words Halloran Trucking Company painted on the door. He wasn't holding a mop in that photo. He was holding a roll of oversized paper, curled like blueprints, a pencil tucked behind one ear. Grandpa, what is this from? He came and stood beside me, coffee in hand, and looked at the photo far longer than the question required. Kept their floors clean, he finally said. And a few other things. Then he asked if I wanted pie, in the tone that means the topic is closed. I let it close. 3 weeks later, I would remember that pencil. 2.5 weeks before the wedding, I took a vacation day and drove Grandpa to Lincoln Elementary, where he still volunteers one morning a month fixing whatever the district's budget can't cover. I hadn't set foot in that building since I was 12. The hallways had shrunk in the way childhood hallways always do, And I finally got to watch, as an adult, how that building treats Samuel Reyes. The front office staff lit up when he walked in. The retired cafeteria cook, Miss Odessa, who runs the food pantry on Tuesdays, hugged him and called him Mr. Reyes in the tone people usually save for surgeons. A janitor 30 years his junior trailed him around like a resident shadowing an attending physician. And above the door of the old custodial closet, laminated and sun-faded, hung a strip of paper in his own blocky handwriting. "Leave it better than you found it." He taped it there for the kids years ago, Miss Odessa told me. Teachers still point to it. While my grandfather rewired a stuck water fountain, Odessa fed me coffee cake and gossip. Then she said something that snagged. "You know that day he dresses up every year? Town car comes for him. Long black thing, driver in a suit. First time I saw it I said, 'Samuel, who died?' And he laughed and said, 'Nobody, Odessa. Some old paperwork just refuses to die. A town car for a pension appointment.'" I chewed my coffee cake and filed that detail away in the drawer where I keep things that don't fit anywhere yet. Then I looked up at the sign over the door one more time and made the decision I'd been circling for a week. It was time to leave something better than I'd found it. The next morning I drove into the city with an envelope of my own. My parents' kitchen island is white quartz, $4,000, according to my mother, who mentions it unprompted. I set the envelope down on it. Inside was their $35,000 check, uncashed, 3 months old, along with one typed page. What I was canceling: the upgraded catering package, the corporate photographer, the floral wall. What I was keeping: the venue, which already had my name on it, and every promise I'd already made to the people I actually loved. My father read the page like a resignation letter. My mother read the check like an obituary. "You can't afford this wedding," she said, and she wasn't wrong. I told her the new wedding would be one I could afford, which, I reminded her, was the entire point of a wedding, back when they still worked that way. Nobody raised their voice. My family doesn't yell. We just quietly revise our forecasts. I drove the 90 minutes home with the radio off and my spine straight. That night, I sat at my own kitchen table with an $11 calligraphy pen and did the small thing that, in hindsight, was the entire war. I hand-lettered every place card myself, saving his for last. Brown ink, my best handwriting, stood upright on my windowsill above the sink where I'd see it every single morning for the next 2 weeks. Samuel Reyes, head table. It's a strange thing, arming yourself with cardstock, but every morning while the coffee brewed, that little folded tent stood there like a fence post, and I'd read it once before heading out on shift. Thursday brought my father's voicemail. 11 seconds, flat as an incident report. "You're embarrassing us in front of the most important people in my career." I played it back 3 times. He never once noticed what he'd just ranked. Here is what a wedding looks like once you hand back $35,000. The live band became a retired high school music teacher named Gloria and a tuned-up upright piano, courtesy of a man who owed my grandfather a favor from 1997. The floral wall became garden roses cut from 3 different backyards along Jordan's mother's block, because once word got out that our wedding had lost its florist, half the neighborhood started volunteering their gardens like it was a war effort. Miss Odessa took over the gap in catering, and the food pantry ladies baked as if their reputations depended on it. Was I sad about any of it? I keep checking that pocket, and I keep finding it empty. My mother, on the other hand, was sad enough for both of us. "Without us it's a potluck, not a wedding," she said on the phone, and then, in the silky voice she reserves for closing a sale, "Your father and I have actually been asking ourselves whether we can attend something like this at all." There it was, the last card in the deck, played casually, like an afterthought. Attendance itself on the table. "I hope you'll be there," I said and meant it and hated that I meant it. We hung up on a silence with teeth in it. 2 days later, a reply card landed in my own mailbox, which, as an EMT who spends her days rushing toward other people's emergencies, genuinely made me laugh out loud. Heavy cardstock. Confident fountain pen ink. Mr. Marcus Whitfield accepts with pleasure. The CEO of Vantage Rail and Freight was coming to my potluck. I stood at my mailbox laughing, and then not quite laughing, because my father had invited the one guest he could least afford to have witness any of this. Whatever my parents decided about their own attendance, that cream-colored card had just decided the stakes for them. My father called on a Sunday night with what I think of as his negotiation voice. All warm leather, no actual floor underneath it. He'd been thinking, he said. He wanted to offer a path forward. Option 1. Grandpa attends the ceremony only, churches are humble, and quietly skips the reception. He hates crowds anyway. He'd probably be relieved. Option 2. He attends the reception, seated at table 16, reframed now as a kindness. Near the exit, Melanie. For his comfort. The man is 79. I sat on my porch steps listening to my father redesign his own shame as compassion, and I'll give him this. It was a better draft than his last one. When he finished, I said, "He doesn't dislike crowds, Dad. He dislikes being hidden." Those aren't the same thing. A long pause. Then quieter, with the leather worn thin. "You don't understand what one dinner can cost a man." That was the closest to honest he'd been all year. Part of me wanted to meet him there, to ask him about the boy with the ruined lunch tray, to tell him I finally knew. Managing my family is my oldest habit, and old habits fight hardest right before you finally quit them. But I looked through the window at that small square of cardstock standing on my sill, and I held my ground right there on the porch, grateful he couldn't see my free hand shaking. The seat is his, Dad. He exhaled through his nose, the sound he makes when a vendor won't budge. Then we'll see who actually shows up, he said, and was gone. 2 nights before the rehearsal, I found my grandfather on his porch, radio playing low, gluing the sole of a shoe most men would have thrown away years ago. He didn't look up. "Don't lose your family over a chair, kid. I can love you from any table in that room." I sat down on the step below him, the same step where I'd shelled beans as a girl and cried over boys and memorized state capitals, and for once in my careful, overmanaged, level-voiced life, I said the true thing without wrapping it in anything. "You are my family. You're the one who stayed." The glue brush stopped moving. My grandfather looked out at the yard like something in the hedge suddenly needed his full attention, took off his glasses, and cleaned them on his shirt tail for a long, long time. That's how men his age cry, in case you've ever wondered. Then he put them back on and said, "Weather's turning." "Sure is," I said. We sat there in the kind of silence you could live inside forever. When I got up to leave, I watched through the front window as he crossed to the old roll-top desk in his den, the one drawer he keeps locked, key riding on the same ring as his brass school keys. He opened it and just stood there looking down at something. A thick manila envelope, soft at the corners from decades of handling. He didn't take it out. He touched it once, the way you touch a headstone. Then he locked the drawer and turned off the lamp. I drove home telling myself it was pension paperwork. Old deeds. Nothing. 2 nights later, my parents arrived at the rehearsal 40 minutes early. Before I tell you what happened in that dressing room, let me ask, if a grandparent ever showed up for you the way your own parents couldn't, would you tap that like button for them? Mine drove me to school for 11 straight years and never once missed a pickup. And subscribe, because what that CEO said in front of 200 people is the part of the story people still don't believe until I tell it twice. My father does not arrive early. In 55 years, that man has never once shown up ahead of schedule out of enthusiasm. He arrives early to negotiate. The rehearsal itself was lovely, which in hindsight should have worried me. Golden light through stained glass, the officiant walking us through the processional twice, Jordan's sister crying during the practice run, which everyone agreed was a good omen. My grandfather stood at the back of the aisle in his cardigan, holding my elbow with the exact pressure of a man who has spent a lifetime carrying fragile things and knows precisely which ones can break. Then, while the wedding party ate lemon bars in the vestibule, my father said, "Melanie." A word. Family only. The small dressing room off the vestibule is all dark wood and hanging choir robes. My parents arranged themselves inside it like a closing team. My mother held a freshly printed seating chart, as if the last month had simply been a clerical misunderstanding. My father kept his voice low, because the door was thin and that was exactly the point. "We're asking one final time. Move Samuel off the head table. Whitfield will be 14 feet away. Directors, spouses, cameras. He's a retired janitor, Melanie. He's an embarrassment." And then my mother did the thing I will never fully forgive. She reached into the trash can near the vestment table and pulled out the head table place cards she'd apparently found earlier during her venue walkthrough. She held up the little brown ink tent that read Samuel Reyes, and she crumpled it. Not violently. That's the part one can't shake. She crumpled it absently, the way you crumple a piece of junk mail, saying, "We'll just have the calligrapher redo it. It'll look intentional." The paper barely made a sound. And in the doorway behind them, holding 3 lemon bars on a napkin he'd brought to share with us, stood my grandfather. He'd heard every word. I watched his spine straighten one vertebra at a time, like a flag going up a pole. Nobody in that room moved. He set the napkin of lemon bars down gently on the vestment table, the way you defuse something, and said, "I'll wait in the truck, kiddo." It was the kiddo that broke something loose in me. No wobble in it at all. A man comforting his granddaughter while his own son stood 10 feet away, calling him an embarrassment through a door. Something in me went quiet and very, very organized, the way it does mid-shift when a call comes in and there's nothing left to do but act. I stepped past my father, picked the crumpled card out of the trash, and smoothed it flat against my knee, crease by crease, slowly, letting the whole room watch me do it. The seat is his. It's not up for a vote, Dad. He is the table. He's the entire reason there's a family here to seat in the first place. My father started to say something about optics. I wasn't finished. If you walk out tonight, that's your choice to make. But if you come Saturday, you come as guests. Regular guests. No run of show, no photo protocol, no seating optics. You tried to buy a nicer version of this family for $35,000. And when I handed the check back, you started spending relatives instead. That version isn't for sale. The door had drifted open. The entire wedding party stood frozen in the vestibule, lemon bars halfway to their mouths, and I let them stand there, because my parents taught me a long time ago that witnesses change behavior. For once, the lesson worked in my favor. My mother recovered first. "You're being dramatic. We'll discuss this tomorrow." But my father buttoned his suit jacket. One button, the tell of a man closing a meeting that has stopped going his way. "Then enjoy your potluck," he said. They walked out past the officiant, past the frozen wedding party, past their own reflections in the sanctuary glass, and the heavy door swung shut behind them with a sound like a gavel. Into the silence, our officiant cleared his throat, kind and a little lost, like a country vet. "So, who's walking the bride down the aisle, then?" I want to be honest about what winning felt like that night. It felt like losing. There's no trophy for holding a line against your own parents. There's just an empty parking lot, your fiancé's hand steady on your back, and the front seat of your own truck, because that's the only place in the whole world that's ever belonged entirely to you. Jordan didn't try to fix anything. He just sat there, folded up in the passenger seat, holding my hand while I shook. Then we drove to my grandfather's, because there was nowhere else that night could possibly end. He'd left the porch light on. He always leaves the porch light on. One look at my face and he disappeared inside, coming back with a slice of pie I hadn't asked for and a small square of pressed cotton, white with a blue border, embroidered with forget-muts. My grandmother's handkerchief. "Something borrowed," he said. "She'd want it back eventually. That handles the borrowed part." I laughed, and it came out wet. Then my grandfather looked out at the dark yard and said the strangest thing, in the exact same tone he uses to discuss the weather. I wasn't always just the janitor kid, but being the janitor was never the part one was ashamed of. "Your father got that backwards a long time ago." I asked him what he meant. "The first part." He patted my hand, told me a bride needed her sleep, and pushed himself up with both hands on his knees, the way he always does. Conversation over. At the door, I turned around. "Walk me down the aisle Saturday." He went very still. "You sure you want these old knees jangling down an aisle?" "That's a yes." I was nearly asleep when my phone lit up the ceiling. My mother, 11:04 p.m. "We will attend Saturday. For appearances. We owe your father's company that much." I read it 4 times. By the 4th read, I was almost grateful, because it was the single most honest sentence my mother had produced all year. They came back for the audience they'd walked out on. The Saturday of my wedding was one of those flawless blue autumn days, the kind the sky hands out as an apology for winter. My parents were there, 3rd pew, right side, dressed to perfection, wearing the same smiles from my mother's real estate flyers. I later learned their decision to return had firmed up almost exactly 11 minutes after word of Marcus Whitfield's RSVP hit the regional office group chat. Even knowing why they came, some part of me that will never fully grow up was still glad to see the backs of their heads. Then I stopped looking at them entirely, because my grandfather was standing beside me in his one good suit, navy, older than Jordan, pressed to razor creases, brown shoes shining with his own elbow grease. He'd left his brass keyring at home but tucked the little worn leather fob into his breast pocket anyway. For luck, he said. 40 years of locking up behind everybody else. Figured tonight I'd walk someone in for a change. Don't you dare, I told my eyes. My eyes did it anyway. The ceremony was short and true. Gloria played the church organ like she was 25 again. Jordan's vows had an actual footnote, because of course they did. Mine were a single paragraph, and the man who taught me every word of them sat 6 feet away, in the seat where the father of the bride belongs, and nobody had dared touch that card again. At 5 o'clock, as the light turned gold across the hall, our venue coordinator touched my elbow. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Whitfield's car just pulled in. Here's what my parents' version of my reception looked like, running quietly inside my potluck like an embassy operating on foreign soil. My father intercepted Marcus Whitfield at the coat check and began what I can only describe as a networking safari, steering him from director to director, a hand hovering permanently near the CEO's shoulder, wine glass never actually touched. My mother had already scouted the one corner with flattering light and no support pillar, gently herding photogenic guests into it all evening like a border collie in silk. 14 feet away sat the version of the evening I had actually paid for. The head table on its low riser, Jordan's parents, his sister, my college roommate, promoted from the restroom table in one stroke of a pen. And at my right hand, in the seat of honor, a crease-scarred place card standing upright in front of a water glass. Samuel Reyes. Brown ink, slightly wrinkled, entirely legible. My grandfather held court without saying more than 50 words the entire evening, while Miss Odessa and the food pantry crew kept his plate full like a pit crew. Every so often I caught my father's eyes drift toward that battered little card and then flick away. The evening was warm. The neighborhood roses were ridiculous and perfect. Gloria owned that upright piano. I had almost stopped watching the room like it was a call I was waiting on when I noticed something at the far end of the ballroom. Marcus Whitfield had stopped listening to my father mid-sentence. His eyes had drifted past my father's shoulder and locked onto the head table. His eyebrows were doing something slow and complicated, the look of a man squinting at an address he swears he's delivered to before, in another life. He set down his glass. "Excuse me one moment," he said, to no one in particular, which in that instant happened to be my father. And he started walking. You have to understand the physics of a room like that. 200 guests, 40 minutes into dinner, everyone quietly watching everyone else, and suddenly the most important man in the building is walking a straight line with obvious intent. Conversation died table by table behind him, dominoes going down on felt. My mother's radar swung around instantly. My father stood stranded near the coat check, his sentence unfinished, hands still shaped for a shoulder that had just left. Whitfield passed the cake table, past the wedding party, past me with a small, unreadable nod. My whole body went cold with a single thought: he's going to say something about the janitor. My father got there half a step behind him. This was happening. At my wedding. Whitfield stopped directly in front of my grandfather. My grandfather set down his fork, wiped his mouth unhurried, and looked up with the calm face of a man who's been expecting a bus he always knew would eventually arrive. The whole ballroom had gone so quiet I could hear ice shift in someone's glass. Miss Odessa froze mid-pour, coffee pot suspended in the air. Gloria lifted her hands off the piano keys and left them hovering. Marcus Whitfield, CEO of Vantage Rail and Freight, buttoned his jacket and drew himself up the way men of his generation do right before they say something they consider historic. If your pulse is picking up reading this, mine was roaring, and I was standing in the middle of it in a white dress with absolutely no idea what was coming next. Whitfield extended both hands, the two-handed clasp they apparently teach somewhere far above my father's pay grade. His voice carried to every corner of that ballroom without a single microphone anywhere near him. "Welcome back, Founder Reyes." That was all. That was everything. I watched that sentence roll across my own reception like weather rolling in off open water. The vantage tables heard it first, and their polite quiet turned into the specific, electric silence of employees doing rapid arithmetic. Founder Reyes. The bride is a Reyes. The vice president standing right there is a Reyes. And the old man in the pressed navy suit, with the crease-scarred place card in front of his water glass, is apparently something else entirely. I found my father's face in the crowd, and I will describe exactly what happened to it, because in my memory that face is the story. It went white, not pale white, the color of a man watching 30 years of arithmetic come apart in front of an audience. His wine glass tilted in his hand. A nearby director caught it before it fell. My mother, one table over, had simply stopped moving, her expression still frozen mid-smile from the last photograph while her eyes searched desperately for the nearest exit. And my grandfather shook Marcus Whitfield's hand the way he shakes everyone's hand once firm, like a latch clicking shut. "Marcus," he said, "you're interrupting the salad course." The CEO of a company with thousands of employees laughed like a schoolboy, asked permission to join the table, and sat down across from Miss Odessa, who poured him coffee with the calm of a woman who has fed too many important men to be impressed by one more. What the room got next wasn't a speech. It was history nobody had ever printed in a brochure. Standing there with his coffee, Whitfield asked the bride's permission with a small bow that made the food pantry lady swoon, and gave my wedding 60 seconds of a story that exists nowhere else. In 1988, he explained, the old Halloran Trucking Company was 90 days from bankruptcy, and a depot maintenance worker nobody had ever thought to ask stayed late one night and redrew the entire regional routing system by hand on the back of packing paper, hub-and-spoke load consolidation, the exact bones of the network the company still runs on today. Halloran had the good sense to actually listen. That maintenance man quietly became a silent partner. When the company reorganized years later as Vantage Rail and Freight, he sold back his operating stake but kept 40% through a private holding company, took the title of chairman emeritus, and asked for exactly one thing in return: that his name stay out of it entirely. Halloran wanted a self-made founder story for the customers, Whitfield said, and Samuel wanted to be home by 6. Turns out both men got exactly what they asked for. Halloran had passed 7 years ago, and Whitfield said he figured that old promise had been kept long enough. "I meet with him once a year," he added, lifting his cup toward my grandfather, "and every single year he tells me the same thing, that every route this company runs was drawn by a man half this room walked past for decades without ever really seeing him." I used to think that was modesty talking. It wasn't. It was precision. The pen with the compass rose. The same compass rose watermarking my father's slides. The town car. The annual appointment in the good navy suit. The pencil behind his ear in that hallway photograph. The thick manila envelope in a locked roll-top drawer. Every odd sock in my memory drawer suddenly paired itself in about 4 seconds, and I had to grab Jordan's arm just to stay upright. I watched my mother do the same math and land somewhere entirely different. She was already sliding her chair. You have never in your life witnessed a renovation completed as fast as the one my parents performed on themselves over the following 10 minutes. My mother materialized at my grandfather's elbow with a dessert plate, laughing at something he hadn't actually said, her chair now somehow adjacent to his, telling Miss Odessa they simply had to get his pie recipe. "Dad," she called him, a word I had not once heard cross her lips in my entire living memory. My father shook Whitfield's hand and said something about family running deep at the company, and his voice held. That's the training talking. But his color still hadn't fully returned, and his eyes kept sliding off his own father like tires losing traction on ice. My grandfather received all of it the way he receives everything. Like weather passing through. Then my father touched my arm. "Hallway. 1 minute. Please." I should have known better. Out by the coat check, my father, 55 years old, a man who had just watched his life's ambition collapse in front of 200 witnesses, looked at me with an expression I had wanted my entire childhood. Warm. Open. Urgent. Focused entirely on me. "You have to fix this," he said. "Tonight, before Ray leaves. Talk to your grandfather. Tell him about the VP chair. He'll listen to you, Melanie. You're the only one he's ever listened to." And then he laid the roof over the whole thing. And after that, sweetheart, all of it, the rehearsal, the seating, everything, we put it behind us. Clean slate. We're a family again. There it was. Everything I had wanted since I was 6 years old, handed to me in a hallway at a price. 22 years I had waited for my father to call me sweetheart in that particular voice. It took a stranger's greeting to finally teach it to him. I looked back through the doorway at the head table, where my grandfather was calmly working through his salad like a man with no secret history whatsoever. And I felt the oldest muscle in my body flex on instinct. The fixer, the translator, the girl who smooths every rough edge in the room. Because here, finally, was the exact deal I'd been trained my whole life to make. One conversation, and I could deliver my entire family gift-wrapped. All I had to do was become the go-between one more time. All I had to do was spend my grandfather's seat of honor on a chair my father had never actually earned. I heard myself exhale. No, I said. My father blinked. Hannah, Melanie, you wanted a better table. He built the room, Dad. I said it quietly, the same flat, level voice he'd trained into me without ever meaning to. Then I walked back into my own reception and left him standing alone in that hallway with his clean slate. What happened next took about 90 seconds, and it cost me the last version of my childhood I'd been quietly saving. I walked to the DJ booth, moved one item up on the schedule, and picked up the microphone. My voice carried out over 200 people, steady as a hand that's done 1,000 IVs. Ladies and gentlemen, the father-daughter dance. Heads turned toward my father, still standing in the hallway doorway. I watched the room find him, mark him, wait for him to move. I walked the other direction, past my mother's frozen smile, past the vantage tables, straight to the head table, where I stopped in front of a 79-year-old man in a navy suit and offered my open hand. You've walked me through everything else, I said. Walk me through this one too, Grandpa. The room made a sound I genuinely cannot spell. He looked up at me for a long second, glanced once, just once, at his son by the doorway, and then Samuel Reyes pushed himself up with both hands flat on the table and took my hand, leading me onto a dance floor his entire life had earned. Gloria didn't play the song on the program. She looked at my grandfather, caught some tiny signal I'll never be able to decode, and started into What a Wonderful World on that old upright, slow and plain, the way it sounds drifting out of a kitchen radio. My grandfather dances like a man who learned in a living room, with a woman he loved, decades ago. Small steps. Steady frame. Counting under his breath out of 50-year-old habit. 1, 2, 3. And I was 11 again, standing on his shoe tops. Except this time I was crying into a navy lapel that smelled like cedar and drugstore aftershave. Around us the whole room stood, and I let every one of them blur. I understood something during that song that I'd been circling my entire life, and I'll give it to you exactly as plain as it arrived. I had spent 22 years believing that belonging to my family was a job with quarterly performance reviews, that if I just managed everything well enough, translated hard enough, sanded down enough edges, I would eventually earn my chair. And the entire time, the only person who never once made me apply for his love was the man whose hands were rough from keyrings and bleach and other people's floors. Belonging isn't a wage. It's a gift, or it's nothing at all. Somewhere past the second verse, I whispered the only thing left to say, straight into cedar and aftershave. Leave it better than you found it. My grandfather's arm tightened half an inch. Old men don't sob. They compress. You just did, kid, he said. When the song ended, he didn't give a speech. He raised my hand the way you'd raise a partner at the end of a square dance, turned to face the room, and lifted his water glass in the other hand. To my granddaughter, said the quietest man I have ever loved, in a voice that reached the coat check, who never once asked what a person was worth before she loved them. 200 glasses went up. Miss Odessa's coffee pot went up. And by the time the applause finally settled and the lights came back to normal, the 2 chairs my parents had been sitting in were empty. No goodbye. We cut the cake without them. Here's the accounting 3 months out, because I know you want it, and because after a decade of writing incident reports for a living, I like a clean ledger. The Monday after the wedding, my grandfather took me to lunch at the diner on 4th Street and offered, over meatloaf, to set up a trust, for me, for Jordan, for the house we're renting. I told him no. I want you to understand that wasn't pride, or anger, or performance. It's that I finally understood exactly what he'd been doing for 30 years, quietly sitting on 40% of an empire out of a two-bedroom house with a squeak-free screen door. The money was never the point of him, and I wasn't about to make it the point of us. I kept the two things I'd already accepted, Sunday breakfast and the dance. Everything else in my life, I told him, I'd deliver myself. He grumbled that I was stubborn. Rich, coming from him. He did do one public thing with the money that year, the only public thing he's ever done with it. That spring, the school district announced a new scholarship, full tuition, every year, for graduating kids of the district's custodians, cooks, and bus drivers. He made them promise not to put his name on anything. The one plaque acknowledging it is taped quietly over the same custodial closet door at Lincoln Elementary that's held his handwriting for 20 years. As for my father, nobody fired him. That's not how any of this actually works, and honestly, it's better this way. Daniel Reyes still parks in the same reserved spot at Vantage and works one rung beneath the chair he'll probably never sit in now. Nobody punished him directly. The story simply got around the way stories do. The rehearsal. The walkout. The dance. It turns out optics were the one thing he'd been right about all along. He emailed me in November. 2 lines, no subject line. I didn't know. That's not an excuse. I've read it more times than I'll admit. I haven't answered yet. And here's the one thing my therapist and my grandfather actually agree on, which is a first. I don't know that email an answer on anyone's timeline but my own. The door isn't locked. It's just no longer my job to hold it open. It never was. My mother mailed us a crystal picture frame for Christmas, heavy and imported. The cards sign Mom and Dad in her flawless open house cursive. I did use it. I chose the photo Jordan's cousin caught from the edge of the dance floor, an old man in a navy suit, mid-turn, laughing, and a bride on his arm looking up at him like the entire room belonged to him. Because it did. It always had. We still do Sunday breakfast, 7:30, his kitchen, my turn to bring the eggs. Last week I caught him at the sink afterward, washing my coffee mug before I'd even finished drinking from it. Old habits. I told him the room was already fine, exactly as I'd found it. He laughed so hard he had to sit down. On the windowsill above his sink, tucked under a jelly jar stuffed with pens, there's a small rectangle of cardstock with a crease scarred straight through the middle. Brown ink. My best handwriting. He kept it. My grandfather owned 40% of an empire for 30 years and never once used $1 of it to buy a person. My father chased a title for 30 years and very nearly sold one. So if you take one thing from my wedding, take this. The seat of honor was never about what either man had. Dignity was never a name on an office door. It's what you choose to leave behind, in every single room you're ever trusted to clean. That was Melanie's story. A crumpled place card, a CEO on his feet, and one father-daughter dance that finally told the truth out loud, in front of everyone. If someone in your family ever mistook a title for a person's worth, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one. And tell me this, who earned the head table at your wedding? Subscribe to Quiet Reckonings for more stories about people who finally, quietly, get their say. See you in the next one.